Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
First name, first shock. What would you think if a little girl looked at her mother in the middle of a busy American park and cheerfully called her by her first name instead of Mom? Would you assume she was being disrespectful? I certainly did. In fact, I almost judged an entire family before I understood what was really happening. That single moment completely changed the way I viewed American family culture, my own marriage, and even the way I listened to English conversations. If you've ever felt confused by life in the United States or worried that you were misunderstanding everyday English, stay with me because this story begins with one surprising word. It was a bright Saturday afternoon in our neighborhood park. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass, children were racing across the playground, and parents sat on picnic blankets enjoying the warm sunshine. My husband was helping our son fly a colorful kite while I watched our daughter climb the small wooden bridge near the slides. Everything felt peaceful. Then I heard a little voice behind me. "Emily. Wait for me." I turned around, expecting another child named Emily to come running across the playground. Instead, a little girl, perhaps 7 years old, ran toward a smiling woman carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thanks, Sarah," the little girl said happily. The woman laughed and gently brushed the child's hair away from her face. For a second, I froze. Sarah? Had that little girl just called her own mother by her first name? I quietly looked around to see if anyone else seemed surprised. Nobody reacted. Not one person. Parents continued chatting. Children kept playing. A golden retriever chased a tennis ball across the grass as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside my mind, dozens of questions suddenly appeared. Was this normal? Was it rude? Did American children really call their parents by name? I tried to focus on my family again, but curiosity kept pulling my attention back toward them. A few minutes later, I heard it again. "Sarah, can I have some juice?" The woman smiled warmly. Of course. There was no frustration. No disappointment. No sign that either of them thought anything was wrong. Communication experts often explain that our brains naturally compare unfamiliar behavior with our own cultural experiences. Psychologists call this cultural framing. We automatically judge new situations using the rules we already know. The interesting part is that our first interpretation is not always the most accurate one. That idea hadn't crossed my mind yet. I simply assumed respect had to sound the same everywhere. My daughter suddenly walked over holding a handful of tiny white flowers she had picked from the edge of the field. "Mom, look what I found." I smiled. "They're beautiful." She handed me one flower before running back toward her brother. As I watched my children laughing together, I found myself wondering something unexpected. If one family teaches children to say mom and dad, while another sometimes uses first names, which family is showing more respect? Or was I asking the wrong question altogether? A gentle breeze carried more conversation from the nearby picnic table. This time, I accidentally heard the woman speaking to another parent. "My kids usually call me Sarah at home." She laughed softly. My mother still can't believe it. I almost smiled. Apparently, I wasn't the only person who found it surprising. Just then, our eyes met. She walked toward me with an easy, friendly smile and held out her hand. "Hi, I'm Sarah." I introduced myself. Within seconds, she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. You looked surprised when my daughter called my name. I felt my face grow warm. Before I could answer, she smiled kindly and said, "Would you like to know why we do it?" At that moment, I realized the story I had invented in my head was only the beginning. And the real explanation would challenge everything I thought I knew about respect, family, and love in America. A question I couldn't ignore. Would you like to know why we do it? That simple question stopped me from making the biggest mistake of the day, not a grammar mistake, but a judgment. I had already written an entire story in my mind about Sarah's family without knowing a single fact. If I had politely smiled and walked away, I would have missed one of the most eye-opening conversations I've ever had in the United States. Sometimes the greatest lesson isn't learning a new English word. Sometimes it's discovering that one familiar word can mean something completely different in another culture. I smiled, feeling slightly embarrassed. "I hope you don't mind me asking," I admitted. "I was surprised when your daughter called you Sarah." Sarah laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that made me feel uncomfortable. It was warm, relaxed, and inviting. "You wouldn't be the first person to ask." We found an empty bench while our children continued playing together. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, and the sound of children laughing blended with birds singing above us. It felt like the perfect place for an honest conversation. "My daughter actually calls me both," Sarah explained. "Most of the time it's Mom. Sometimes it's Sarah. It depends on the situation." I blinked. "So you aren't offended?" She smiled. "Not at all." Seeing my confused expression, she continued. "In our family, respect isn't measured by one word. It's measured by how we treat each other every day." That sentence stayed with me. Respect isn't measured by one word. I quietly repeated it in my mind, almost like practicing a new English phrase. Many communication researchers have found that healthy family relationships are built more on trust, emotional safety, and consistent kindness than on specific forms of address. Different families create different traditions, but the strongest relationships usually share the same foundation: mutual respect and open communication. Sarah pointed toward her daughter, who had just helped another little girl pick up toys that had fallen onto the grass. "See that?" I nodded. "That's what matters to me." She smiled proudly. She says please. She says thank you. She apologizes when she's wrong. She helps people without being asked. Sarah paused before adding softly, "If she calls me Sarah once in a while but treats people with kindness every day, I'm doing just fine." I couldn't argue with that. Just then my husband walked over carrying 2 bottles of water. He greeted Sarah warmly, and within minutes they were chatting as if they had known each other for years. I noticed something interesting. Neither of them seemed worried about sounding perfect. They simply listened carefully, smiled often, and asked thoughtful questions. Language experts often explain that real fluency grows through meaningful interaction, not memorized perfection. The most memorable conversations are usually built on curiosity rather than complicated vocabulary. Listening well is often more valuable than speaking flawlessly. Watching them reminded me that learning English isn't only about words. It's about understanding people. Before we left the park, Sarah invited our family to her home for a weekend barbecue. "We'd love for you to come," she said. "Our kids already seem like friends." I smiled. "We'd love that too." As we walked toward the parking lot, I turned to my husband. Do you think it's strange? He looked at me thoughtfully. What? Children calling their parents by name. He smiled. I think it's different. He paused just long enough to make me curious. But different doesn't automatically mean disrespectful. His answer echoed in my mind during the drive home. That evening, while setting the dinner table, our daughter suddenly asked an innocent question. Mom, if I called you by your first name one day, would you still know I love you? I nearly dropped the plates. Before I could answer, my husband looked at me with a knowing smile. Somehow, I had a feeling this conversation was about to become much more personal than either of us expected. Meeting Emily's family. One innocent question from my daughter completely changed the atmosphere at our dinner table. Mom, if I called you by your first name one day, would you still know I love you? I couldn't answer right away because I suddenly realized I had never separated a name from a feeling. In my mind, the two had always belonged together. But what if they didn't? What if love could sound different in different families? A few days later, I accepted Sarah's barbecue invitation. Never imagining that one afternoon inside her home would quietly challenge everything I thought I understood about respect. Saturday arrived with bright sunshine and a cool breeze that made the backyard feel perfect for gathering with friends. My husband carried a bowl of fruit while our children ran ahead, laughing before we even reached the front porch. The smell of grilled vegetables and hamburgers drifted through the air, and cheerful music played softly from a small speaker near the patio. Sarah welcomed us with a warm smile. I'm so glad you came. As we stepped inside, I noticed family photographs covering one wall. There were birthday parties, camping trips, graduations, and holiday dinners. Every picture showed genuine laughter. Nothing about the house felt formal. Everything felt comfortable. Just then, Sarah's daughter came running through the hallway. Sarah, can you help me find my blue sweater? Sure. Sarah answered with a smile. A few seconds later, the little girl wrapped both arms around her mother and whispered, "Love you." I love you too, Sarah replied, kissing the top of her head. I quietly watched the moment. There was no distance between them. No lack of affection. No sign of disrespect. Only warmth. That surprised me more than anything else. During lunch, I finally gathered enough courage to ask another question. Has she always called you Sarah? Sarah laughed. Actually, no. She poured lemonade into our glasses before continuing. When she was little, it was almost always Mom. As she grew older, she started using both. Why? Sarah smiled thoughtfully. Because children experiment with language the same way they experiment with the world. That sentence immediately caught my attention. Language development researchers often explain that children naturally explore different ways of communicating as they grow. They imitate adults, test social boundaries, and learn how language changes depending on relationships and situations. Using different forms of address does not automatically weaken respect. What matters most is the emotional connection behind the words. As if on cue, Sarah's daughter looked toward the kitchen. Mom. I mean Sarah. Everyone laughed. She laughed too. There, Sarah smiled, looking at me. See? Even she mixes them up. The moment felt wonderfully ordinary. Nobody corrected her. Nobody looked embarrassed. The conversation simply continued. Later that afternoon, while the children played soccer in the backyard, Sarah and I sat on the porch with iced tea. I used to worry people would judge our family, she admitted. I looked surprised. They do? Sometimes. She shrugged gently. They hear one word and assume they know our whole story. Her honesty reminded me of my own experience learning English. People sometimes hear one pronunciation mistake and assume the speaker lacks confidence, intelligence, or ability. But real stories are always more complicated than first impressions. Communication experts often remind us that active listening reduces misunderstanding because it encourages curiosity before judgment. The brain naturally creates quick conclusions, but meaningful conversations slow that process down and replace assumptions with understanding. As the afternoon came to an end, Sarah handed me a small container of homemade cookies. For your family. I smiled. Thank you. She paused for a moment before asking something unexpected. Our elementary school is having an open house next week. She looked at me hopefully. Would you like to come with me? I think you'll hear something that answers even more of your questions. I laughed. I thought I'd already asked enough questions. She grinned. Oh, the teachers have even better answers than I do. Driving home, I couldn't stop wondering what could possibly happen at an ordinary school event. I had no idea that one conversation with an elementary school teacher would completely change the meaning of the word respect in my mind forever. Respect looks different. Can one ordinary conversation inside an American elementary school completely change the meaning of respect? I didn't think so. I expected colorful classrooms, children's artwork on the walls, and friendly teachers introducing lesson plans. Instead, I walked into a discussion that quietly challenged years of assumptions I didn't even realize I was carrying. By the time I left that school, I understood something surprising. The strongest families often sound different from one another. But they can still share exactly the same values. The school gymnasium buzzed with happy conversations as parents, teachers, and children moved from table to table. Posters about reading, science, and art decorated the walls, while students proudly showed off their classroom projects. The atmosphere felt welcoming, relaxed, and full of energy. Sarah introduced me to her daughter's teacher, Mrs. Carter. This is my friend, Sarah said. We've been talking about family traditions. Mrs. Carter smiled warmly. I love those conversations. She invited us to sit at a small table near the library corner while children explored nearby learning stations. After a few minutes, Sarah smiled at me. Go ahead. I laughed nervously. You really want me to ask? She nodded. So I did. I've noticed that some children call their parents by their first names. I was honestly surprised. Does that happen often? Mrs. Carter didn't seem shocked by the question at all. In some families, yes, she replied calmly. In others, never. She paused before adding something I immediately wrote down in my notebook. The important question isn't what children call their parents. She smiled. It's how they treat them. That sentence sounded so simple. Yet it completely shifted my perspective. Mrs. Carter explained that every family creates its own traditions. Some children always say mom and dad. Others occasionally use first names, especially if that's the family's preference. What teachers pay attention to is something much deeper. Do children listen? Do they speak kindly? Do they show empathy? Do they respect boundaries? Those behaviors reveal far more than a single word ever could. Family psychologists often explain that respect is expressed through consistent actions rather than titles alone. Healthy communication grows from trust, emotional security, and positive daily interactions. The words people choose matter, but the intention behind those words matters even more. While we talked, I noticed two students walking toward their teacher. One quietly said, "Mrs. Carter, thank you for helping me yesterday." Another simply smiled and gave her a handmade thank you card. Neither moment was dramatic. Both were deeply respectful. As we continued walking through the school, I overheard children practicing short reading exercises. Their teacher encouraged them gently. "If you make a mistake, just try again." Nobody laughed. Nobody felt embarrassed. The classroom felt safe. That reminded me of learning English. Language experts often recommend practicing in supportive environments because confidence develops when mistakes are treated as opportunities instead of failures. Whether children are learning to read or adults are learning English, encouragement helps the brain retain information more effectively than fear ever can. Before leaving, Mrs. Carter looked at me thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When your children make mistakes, what do you hope they remember?" I thought for a moment. "I hope they remember they're still loved." She smiled. "Exactly." She paused. "That's also what we want them to remember at school." Those words stayed with me throughout the drive home. That evening, our family sat together after dinner, talking about everything we had learned. Our son suddenly looked up from his homework. "Mom, do respectful families always look the same?" I smiled. "No. They don't." Before I could explain further, my daughter quietly added something that made the entire room fall silent. "Then why do grown-ups judge families before asking their story?" Nobody answered immediately. Because she had asked the very question I had been asking myself all week. The next morning, Sarah sent me a message. "Would you like to join us for family discussion night at school?" Parents and children ask each other honest questions. I stared at the screen. Somehow, I knew the next question I heard there would be even harder, because this time, it would be directed at me. The school open house. What if a child asked you one question that completely exposed your hidden assumptions? I thought family discussion night would be a pleasant school activity where parents and children answered simple questions and shared a few laughs. Instead, I found myself sitting in a classroom with my heart racing, realizing that the next answer I gave might teach my own children far more than any lesson I had planned. Sometimes, the hardest conversations are also the ones that quietly heal us. The elementary school looked different that evening. Instead of desks arranged in straight rows, teachers had placed chairs in small circles. Soft music played in the background, colorful student artwork covered the walls, and every table held cards with simple conversation starters. One card read, "What makes you feel respected?" Another asked, "When do you feel most understood?" The questions looked easy. They weren't. Mrs. Carter welcomed everyone with a smile. "Tonight isn't about finding perfect answers," she said. "It's about listening." That sentence immediately reminded me of learning English. The best conversations don't happen because every sentence is perfect. They happen because people genuinely want to understand each other. Our family sat together with Sarah and her daughter nearby. Mrs. Carter invited each family to pick a question from a small wooden box. My son reached inside first. He unfolded the card and read it aloud. How do you know someone respects you? The room became surprisingly quiet. My husband answered first. I know someone respects me when they listen, even if they don't agree. Our daughter smiled. I feel respected when people don't laugh at my mistakes. Her words touched me immediately. I realized she wasn't only talking about school. She was talking about life. Then everyone looked at me. I thought carefully before answering. When someone gives me time to explain instead of judging me too quickly. As soon as the words left my mouth, I remembered Sarah at the park. She hadn't become defensive. She had simply invited me to understand. Family therapists often explain that respectful communication depends more on active listening than on winning arguments. Feeling heard reduces defensiveness, strengthens trust, and creates emotional safety. Whether inside a marriage, between parents and children, or while learning a new language, people grow faster when they feel understood. Later, another question appeared on our table. Describe your family in one word. People around the room answered with words like fun, busy, adventurous, and supportive. When it was my turn, I smiled. Learning. My husband looked at me curiously. Learning? I nodded. We're always learning. Learning English. Learning patience. Learning each other. He reached over and squeezed my hand. I like that. Across the room, I noticed Sarah's daughter quietly calling, Mom. A few minutes later, while asking for help with a project, she naturally said, Sarah. Nobody reacted. Nobody corrected her. The conversation continued exactly the same. For the first time, I barely noticed it. Instead, I noticed how gently they spoke to each other. Respect had slowly become something I could see instead of something I expected to hear. Language learning follows a similar pattern. Experts often encourage learners to focus first on understanding meaning rather than translating every single word. The brain becomes more fluent when it recognizes intention, emotion, and context instead of chasing perfect accuracy. As the evening came to an end, Mrs. Carter thanked every family for participating. While people gathered their coats, she quietly walked toward me. I've been watching something, she said. I smiled nervously. What? The questions you ask. I laughed. I ask too many. No. She shook her head gently. You ask honest ones. Then she handed me a sealed envelope. It's for our parent discussion group next week. I looked puzzled. I don't think this belongs to me. She smiled. It does. You've been invited to lead one conversation. I stared at the envelope in disbelief. Me? Led a discussion about family, respect, and communication in English? As I slipped the envelope into my bag, I couldn't stop wondering what question they expected me to answer. I would soon discover that the first question waiting inside was one I had spent my entire life avoiding. My daughter asked me why. The sealed envelope sat on my kitchen counter all night, but somehow it felt much heavier than a few pieces of paper. I kept walking past it, telling myself I would open it later. Deep down, I wasn't afraid of reading English. I was afraid of reading a question that might expose something I still didn't understand about myself. The next evening, my daughter unknowingly opened that conversation before I ever opened the envelope. And her simple question became the turning point of our entire family. We were preparing dinner together, one of my favorite parts of the day. My husband was chopping vegetables while our son carefully set the table. My daughter stood beside me washing strawberries. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Then she looked at me. Mom? Yes? Can I ask something? I smiled. You always can. She hesitated for a second. If another child calls their mom by her first name, should I think they're rude? The kitchen became very quiet. Only the sound of running water filled the room. A week earlier, I probably would have answered immediately. Now I paused. Not because I didn't know the words. Because I wanted to choose the right idea. I don't think we can decide that from one word, I finally said. She tilted her head. Then how do we know? Before I could answer, my husband smiled gently. We watch how people treat each other. My daughter thought about that. So a respect is something we see? He nodded. Exactly. That small conversation stayed with me long after dinner ended. Developmental psychologists often explain that children learn values primarily through observation rather than instruction. They remember how adults respond during everyday moments more than long lectures about good behavior. Respect becomes visible through patience, honesty, kindness, and consistency. Later that evening, I finally opened the envelope from school. Inside was only one card. On it, a single question had been printed in large letters. When did your understanding of respect change? I stared at those words for a long time. At first, I thought about Sarah. Then the park. Then the school. But the more I reflected, the more I realized something surprising. My understanding hadn't changed because someone explained American culture perfectly. It had changed because people patiently allowed me to ask difficult questions without making me feel embarrassed. That realization reminded me of learning English. The moments that helped me most weren't grammar lessons. They were conversations where people smiled, listened, and gave me time to think. Language educators often recommend using meaningful conversations instead of memorizing isolated vocabulary because emotional experiences strengthen long-term memory. When words become connected to real people and genuine feelings, they stay with us much longer. The following afternoon, our family visited Sarah's house again. This time, I paid attention to something completely different. Not what her children called her. How they looked at her. How they thanked her. How they listened when she spoke. When dinner ended, her daughter quietly gathered everyone's empty plates without being asked. Sarah smiled proudly. Thank you. No problem, Mom. A few minutes later, while laughing about an old family story, the same little girl naturally said, Sarah, remember when Dad burned the pancakes? Everyone laughed. The word changed. The respect never did. Driving home, I caught myself smiling. I had spent days focusing on names. Now I was finally seeing actions. Just before bedtime, my daughter knocked gently on my bedroom door. I have one more question. I laughed. I thought we finished all the questions. She smiled. This is the last one. She climbed onto the edge of the bed and looked at me thoughtfully. If respect can sound different in every family. She paused. What if love has different languages too? I opened my mouth to answer. Then I realized I had never asked myself that question before. The parent discussion group was only 2 days away. Something told me that little question from my daughter was about to become the heart of everything I would share. Listening before judging. What if the biggest misunderstanding in your life isn't caused by language, but by how quickly you decide you already understand someone? My daughter's question stayed in my mind for 2 straight days. What if love has different languages too? I thought I was preparing to lead a discussion about respect at the school. Instead, I was slowly discovering that I had been learning a much deeper lesson all along. And the most unexpected teacher wasn't a psychologist, a language expert, or even a parent. It was a room full of ordinary families willing to tell the truth. The parent discussion group met on a quiet Thursday evening in the school library. Unlike the busy open house, the room felt peaceful. A circle of chairs surrounded a small table with coffee, tea, and homemade cookies. There were only about 15 parents, but every face carried a different story. Mrs. Carter greeted me with a warm smile. "Thank you for agreeing to lead tonight." I laughed nervously. "I still think you invited the wrong person." She shook her head. "I invited the person who asks honest questions." Those words made me smile. When everyone had settled into their seats, Mrs. Carter invited me to begin. For a moment, I simply looked around the room. Then I asked the same question that had changed me. "What does respect sound like in your family?" The answers surprised me immediately. One father smiled. "It sounds like my son saying, 'Dad, can we talk?'" A grandmother quietly said, "It sounds like silence when someone needs time to think." A young mother laughed. "In our house, it sounds like 3 children apologizing at the same time." Everyone laughed together. Then Sarah spoke. "Sometimes it sounds like my daughter calling me mom." She smiled. "And sometimes it sounds like Sarah." Nobody reacted. Nobody looked shocked. Because now everyone understood the story behind those words. Listening researchers have found that meaningful conversations become more productive when people ask open-ended questions instead of making quick assumptions. Curiosity slows judgment, allowing the brain to replace stereotypes with real understanding. I realized that was exactly what had happened to me over the past few weeks. As the discussion continued, one father raised his hand. "I grew up in a family where we always used formal titles," he said. "My wife grew up very differently." He smiled toward her. "Our children are creating their own traditions now." His wife nodded. "They're not choosing between our families. They're learning from both." That sentence touched me deeply. Maybe families weren't supposed to look identical. Maybe they were supposed to grow together. Language learning works the same way. Teachers often encourage learners to stop translating every sentence word for word and instead listen for meaning, emotion, and context. Fluency grows when we understand people, not just vocabulary. Near the end of the meeting, Mrs. Carter asked one final question. "What changed your mind recently?" The room became quiet. Then everyone looked at me. I took a slow breath. I used to think respect had one correct sound. I smiled. Now I think respect has many voices. Several parents nodded. I stopped listening for titles. I started watching kindness. The room remained silent for a few seconds. Not an awkward silence. A thoughtful one. After the meeting, as parents gathered their coats, Sarah walked beside me. "I'm proud of you." I laughed. "I almost didn't come." "I know." She smiled. But you came anyway. Walking toward the parking lot, I noticed Emily, another parent from the school, waiting near my car. "I've been hoping to talk to you," she said. She handed me a folded flyer. "Our community center is hosting a family culture day next weekend." I glanced at the headline. "Celebrating different traditions, one community." Emily smiled. "They're looking for one family willing to share a personal story." I looked up. "Why are you giving this to me?" She grinned. "Because your story isn't really about names anymore." She paused. "It's about understanding." As I folded the flyer and placed it in my bag, I had a feeling the next audience wouldn't just hear my story. They might see their own families in it too. Science of family communication. Have you ever realized that the answer you were searching for wasn't hidden inside a dictionary, but inside the way people looked at each other? When I accepted the invitation to speak at our community's Family Culture Day, I thought I would be sharing a simple story about children calling their parents by their first names. Instead, I discovered something much bigger. The event wasn't about proving which tradition was right. It was about understanding why different families could build the same kind of love in completely different ways. And one surprising conversation before my speech nearly changed everything again. The community center was already full when we arrived on Saturday morning. Families from different backgrounds had decorated small booths with homemade food, photographs, children's artwork, and stories about their traditions. Laughter echoed through the large hall, while children moved excitedly from one activity to another collecting colorful stickers. I immediately noticed something beautiful. Every family looked different. Some grandparents lived with their children. Some families had one child. Others had 4. Some parents spoke Spanish with their children. Others switched naturally between English and another language. Yet every conversation carried the same warmth. Before the presentations began, a family counselor named Dr. Wilson welcomed everyone. "We often think communication begins with words," she said. "But real communication begins with attention." That sentence instantly caught my attention. She explained that psychologists have long observed how children develop emotional security. While every family has different customs, strong relationships usually grow through predictable care, active listening, empathy, and trust. Titles like mom, dad, or even first names can carry different meanings depending on the family's culture, but kindness, reliability, and emotional safety are understood almost everywhere. As I listened, I quietly remembered Sarah. Nothing about her daughter's behavior had ever suggested disrespect. The evidence had been there from the very beginning. I simply hadn't been looking in the right place. Communication researchers often describe this as confirmation bias. Our brains naturally search for evidence that supports our first impression while overlooking details that tell a different story. Once we slow down and become curious, we begin noticing information that had always been there. That idea felt strangely familiar. Learning English had taught me exactly the same lesson. When I first practiced listening, I focused on every unfamiliar word. Later, I learned to notice tone, facial expressions, pauses, and emotion. Suddenly, conversations became much easier to understand. Maybe families worked that way too. As the audience settled into their seats, my name appeared on the program. My heart started beating faster. I walked toward the stage carrying only a few handwritten notes. Then I folded them and slipped them into my pocket. I didn't want to read. I wanted to speak honestly. I came here believing I had a story about names, I began. Soft smiles appeared across the audience. But I realized I actually have a story about listening. The room became completely quiet. I described the afternoon at the park. The school conversations. My daughter's unexpected questions. Sarah's patience. Mrs. Carter's wisdom. I admitted how quickly I had judged something I didn't yet understand. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I noticed people nodding. Several parents smiled as if they had experienced similar moments themselves. Language teachers often encourage learners to stop fearing imperfect English because genuine communication depends more on connection than perfection. A kind smile, careful listening, and honest curiosity often build stronger conversations than flawless grammar ever can. Looking around the room, I realized those same principles also strengthen families. As the audience applauded, I felt relieved. Then an elderly man slowly raised his hand. "I have one question," he said kindly. The room became silent again. He smiled warmly before asking, "If your daughter called you by your first name tomorrow?" He paused just long enough to make my heart race. "What would you say?" I opened my mouth. But for the first time since this journey began, I wasn't completely sure what my answer would be. One dinner changed everything. "What would you say if your daughter called you by your first name tomorrow?" That gentle question stayed with me long after the applause faded. I smiled at the audience that afternoon, but inside, I knew I hadn't answered it completely. Maybe there wasn't a perfect answer. Maybe the real answer could only appear in an ordinary moment at home. Just 2 nights later, during what I expected to be a simple family dinner in our kitchen, life quietly gave me that chance, and the lesson was far more beautiful than I could have imagined. The evening began like so many others. My husband was stirring a pot of homemade soup while our son carefully placed napkins on the table. Outside the kitchen window, the summer sky slowly turned shades of orange and pink. Our daughter walked in carrying a small notebook from school. "I have something to show everyone," she announced with a huge smile. We all sat down. She opened the notebook. "Our teacher asked us to write about what respect means." She looked at me. "Can I read mine?" "Of course," I said. She cleared her throat and began. "Respect is listening when someone is talking." She smiled. "Respect is saying sorry when you're wrong." She turned another page. "Respect is helping people even when nobody is watching." My heart already felt full. Then she reached the final sentence. "Respect isn't one word. It's how love behaves every day." The room became completely silent. I recognized those ideas immediately. Not because I had taught them during a lecture. Because she had watched them happen. Family researchers often explain that children build their understanding of values through repeated everyday experiences. Consistent kindness, emotional warmth, and honest conversations shape character far more effectively than occasional instructions. In many ways, children learn by observing what adults repeatedly do rather than simply remembering what adults say. I smiled proudly. That was beautiful. She looked at me with curious eyes. "I have one more question." Everyone laughed softly. It seemed our family had become famous for unexpected questions. She hesitated. "If I accidentally called you by your first name one day?" My husband quietly looked at me. "Would you still hug me?" This time I didn't hesitate. I reached across the table, held her hand, and smiled. I would hug you before I answered. She laughed. Really? Really? I paused. Because your words matter. I gently squeezed her hand. But your heart matters even more. Her smile grew even wider. At that moment, I realized the fear I had carried since the park had completely disappeared. Language learning had changed in the same way. When I first spoke English, I worried about every mistake. Now I cared much more about connecting with people than impressing them. Communication specialists often encourage learners to focus on successful interaction instead of perfect performance. Confidence grows when speakers value understanding over flawless accuracy. Real fluency develops one meaningful conversation at a time. After dinner, our family walked through the neighborhood as the evening air became cooler. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks while neighbors waved from their front porches. We passed Sarah's house. She was watering flowers with her daughter. The little girl noticed us first. Mom, she called happily. A few moments later she laughed. Sarah, look. They're here. Everyone smiled. This time I smiled too. The two words sounded different. The love sounded exactly the same. As we continued walking, my husband slipped his hand into mine. You've changed. I looked at him. In a good way? The best way. He smiled. You stopped trying to decide which family was right. You started trying to understand why families are different. His words felt like the final piece of a puzzle. Just before we reached home, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Mrs. Carter. Would you consider sharing your story at our annual Family Appreciation Celebration tomorrow evening? I smiled. Then I noticed the final line. Several children have prepared a surprise for you. I had no idea what that surprise could possibly be. But something told me the next 24 hours would give this story the ending it had been quietly building toward from the very first moment I heard a little girl say the name Sarah. Respect has many languages. What if the greatest English lesson you ever learned had nothing to do with grammar? What if the most unforgettable sentence wasn't found in a textbook but spoken by a child who simply understood love? As I walked into the school's family appreciation celebration, I thought I was attending the final event of an unforgettable journey. I had no idea that the children had prepared a surprise powerful enough to change not only the ending of my story, but also the way I would listen to people for the rest of my life. The school auditorium glowed with warm lights as families filled the seats. Children's artwork decorated every wall, each drawing celebrating kindness, friendship, and family. Laughter echoed across the room, but beneath the cheerful atmosphere I felt a quiet excitement. Mrs. Carter smiled as soon as she saw me. I'm glad you came, she said. I wouldn't have missed it, I replied. She handed me a small envelope with only my first name written on the front. Don't open it yet. I nodded and slipped it into my pocket. The celebration began with short performances. Some children sang songs, others shared poems about gratitude, and a group of students read simple stories they had written themselves. Their English wasn't perfect, but nobody cared. Every sentence carried honesty, and every smile made the audience applaud even louder. Watching them reminded me of something every language teacher hopes students will understand. Fluency grows through courage, not perfection. Research in educational psychology shows that learners remember language more effectively when positive emotions and meaningful experiences are involved. Encouragement reduces anxiety, while genuine communication strengthens long-term memory. I realized that my own English had improved most during moments when people listened patiently instead of correcting every tiny mistake. Then Mrs. Carter stepped onto the stage. Today, she announced, our students wanted to thank someone who reminded us that understanding begins with curiosity. My heart skipped a beat. She looked directly at me. Would you please come up here? The audience applauded as I slowly walked toward the stage. A group of children stood waiting with colorful handmade cards. One by one, they handed them to me. Each card contained one sentence. Thank you for listening. Thank you for asking questions. Thank you for being kind. Then my daughter walked forward holding the final card. She smiled with the quiet confidence that had grown throughout this journey. I wrote this one myself, she whispered. I opened it carefully. Inside, in neat handwriting, she had written, love doesn't always sound the same, but it always feels the same. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The room became wonderfully quiet. I hugged her tightly, and the audience applauded again. Looking around the auditorium, I suddenly understood why this story had touched so many families. It had never been about whether American children should call their parents mom, dad, or by their first names. It had always been about choosing understanding before judgment. Choosing curiosity before assumptions. Choosing kindness before criticism. Those choices build stronger families, stronger friendships, and even stronger language skills. When we learn English, we don't simply memorize vocabulary. We learn to connect with people whose experiences may be different from our own. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to replace fear with confidence and misunderstanding with empathy. As our family walked home beneath the evening sky, my daughter slipped her hand into mine. Mom? Yes? I'm still going to call you Mom. I laughed. I like that. She smiled. But now I know something important. What's that? She looked up at me with bright eyes. Respect has many languages. I smiled because I finally understood exactly what she meant. That simple sentence became the ending I never expected and the lesson I will carry with me every time I speak English. Every time I meet someone from a different culture, and every time I choose to listen before I judge. That's all for today. I'll be making many more stories like this in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next slow English reading journey.